is a different subject, as many of you know, and that is the subject of a linguistic examination of two vocal features that we find in younger, highly educated American women. But before we get into the brunt of the presentation, I do have Karen Nagel here, who is with us today, who is going to be introducing her friend Jordan. So if we will, I'm going to spotlight Karen and take it away.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming and joining in this incredible opportunity. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my friend Jordan. He represents debtors, purchasers, creditors, and bankruptcy proceedings throughout the United States. He is a fellow of the American College of Bankruptcy, an adjunct professor at the School of Law of Arizona State University, and he has a national reputation for representing clients in diverse industries. For instance, Jordan represented the iconic Manhattan restaurant, the Russian Tea Room, in its bankruptcy filing, and he acted as debtors counsel for the Phoenix Coyotes. He led the team to their ultimate sale. He's also represented the Boston Celtics and the Milwaukee Bucks. Jordan's strong sense of fairness and justice has propelled him to lead his firm's diversity and inclusion task force. And as such, he sets an example to all of us who are fortunate to be his friends and within the legal community of really living his values. In addition, he's a really talented jazz pianist. He's husband to my best friend, father to two Menschlichkeit girls. And I happened to have the opportunity to hear him give this discussion at a CLE for attorneys, and I found it fascinating. So I hope that you all do too, and welcome, Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And I'm going to just jump in with one little additional part that many of you may not know, because you won't find this necessarily on his bio on his firm's website. But Jordan is a senior partner in one of the largest law firms in the United States called Perkins Coie. We've also had, if any of you remember, Howard Cabot, who shared about the Guantanamo Bay story that he shared. So same law firm, but Jordan is actually a religious Jew who chairs the offices of his law firm's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. And we are very fortunate to have you here, Jordan. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you both. I'm humbled by the invitation, by your introduction of me, and it's really a pleasure to see so many of you. I'm hoping that I can hold your interest for the next half hour or so. As Karen mentioned, I did really create this presentation, which can last up to 3 hours. I assure you we won't go that long here today. And I've spent some time really paring back some of the content so that we can hit the highlights of what this is all about, and really talk about one particular vocal trait that many of you, maybe most of you, have really probably noticed. And those of you who haven't noticed it will know what we're talking about pretty quickly. But really in the context of understanding why it shouldn't, even though it might, presently annoy us, why it shouldn't annoy us, and the kinds of things that we should be thinking about when especially younger people, and especially people who are still disadvantaged, such as women in the workplace, what happens when we overreact to things that they do differently from what we're used to. And so I'm going to share my screen and make sure that you can all see this presentation that will hopefully be something that will help as we go through this, and you won't have to listen quite as carefully to my droning on about all of this. But here we have the title, which is Uptalk and Implicit Bias. And if you don't know what either of those two things mean, you're about to, if I do my job and keep your interest. And we're going to start off by something that that was written in a very famous book called Blink by an even more famous author named Malcolm Gladwell. Many of you may be familiar with Mr. Gladwell's work. One of the things he talked about, and principally one of the main focuses of this book, Blink, is the way that our brain uses shortcuts to be able to make judgments about our experiences in a very quick, very efficient, and often very effective way. He says our unconscious reactions come out of a locked room, and we can't look inside that room. But with experience, we can become expert at using our behavior and our training to interpret and decode what lies behind our snap judgment and first impressions. So when we talk about snap judgments, I think we all know what we're talking about. We're talking about these instinctual things that we think and sometimes do in reaction to the kinds of things that our senses pick up. Now, sometimes we're reacting to things other than our visual cues, but most of the time we let our eyes tell us how to react to certain things. And when we're dealing with people, we let our eyes tell us something about that person before we ever really interact with them in any real way. And some of those cues that we get by using our eyes to interact with those people tell us how we're supposed to react in an unconscious way. We make snap judgments about them based on race, based on their age, based on their gender or their sex, based on their attractiveness. We use lots of different cues. Those are just examples of ways that our brain is going to use shortcuts to be able to make judgments about people that we meet based on what we see. Now, we also sometimes use auditory clues, things that our ears tell us. That's what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but not before we can talk about how our brain works and why sometimes our brains can lie to us. Now, our judgments are based on instinct, and we know that. And our instincts come from our own experiences, and they come from how we were raised. So our judgments are learned rather than inherited. Okay, obviously a baby doesn't have any of these things. There's nothing inherent about our judgments. Judgments are not even uniform among people across the world. Instincts generally are, but judgments aren't. And we're going to talk about the difference between instinct and judgment here in 1 second. Judgments are learned behaviors, okay? We make judgments because they're based on our instincts. Instincts are what they are, but the judgments we draw from those instinctual reactions, those are peculiar to us, and more specifically, they're peculiar to who we are as members of a culture, because those of us in a group tend to have the same judgments based on the same instinctual reactions to the same stimuli. These judgments come from these mental shortcuts. Scientists call them cognitive heuristics. Okay, these are just shortcuts that our brains use to help us make judgments quickly and efficiently. So we've evolved as human beings to be able to make these kinds of judgments because they're really useful. We can't think about things very carefully all the time because it wouldn't be safe for us to do that. And we rely on these judgments that we make because mainly they're reliable. They tell us the right answer most of the time. And they help us in ways that are really important to us. They help us avoid danger. They help us maximize our encounters with other people so that we can form friendships quickly. We can establish trust or develop suspicion very quickly. We can compete better for resources. When we were hunting or gathering things back many thousands of years ago, we were doing that based on instincts that we have. Now we see it when we watch baseball. A center fielder that knows exactly where to run before the ball gets to him is using these mental shortcuts to have a better idea where that ball is going. It makes him a better fielder. So these are useful instinctual judgments that we're making, okay? We'd probably be dead if we didn't make these judgments because we would put ourselves constantly in danger and then not be able to react quickly enough to the danger to keep ourselves safe. So it's important that we rely on these instinctual judgments and we learn to trust them. The problem is that most of the time, even though they're useful and they're not deceptive, sometimes the instincts that feed into them are biased. It means that they are unfair. They're lying to us in some important way. Okay? This is the problem with instinctual bias. We have to recognize and that understand that all of us have these instinctual judgments about people that can be dishonest or misleading, or at very least, just unreliable, that we shouldn't trust them instinctively because they can be unreliable to us. We tend to think, for example, that our own personal experiences with a person that we associate as a member of a group predicts that we would find that person to match our instinctual reactions about all that group as a whole. Now you can probably see where I'm going with this. We've said before, we make judgments every minute of every day based on these generalizations that we make about groups of people. We generalize because if we don't do that, every single person we meet, we're going to have to deal with on their own from scratch, and those are not going to be effective ways that human beings interact with one another. So we try very much to make sure that the way we interact with people is fair, but we can't help it. We've got instincts that drive our judgments before we ever know that they're happening. They're feeding into our judgment about people that we meet based on the instincts about what we've sort of inherited and what we've come to know about the generalizations we make about people that fit that group. And the problem is some of those are really just biased. They're biases. Now, we call these things unconscious biases. I want you to be aware of something. I'm going to repeat this repeatedly. I'm going to accuse all of you, and I'm going to accuse myself of having unconscious bias. We all have them. This is not calling anybody here a bigot or a bad person or a bad anything. It's just the way we are as human beings. We can't help it. These biases are written into us like they're inscribed in stone, like they're written into our DNA. Bias is a part of the way we think. We have biases that tell us how to keep ourselves safe. We have a bias that says our instinctual reaction to our car going too fast is to slow down because it's not safe. We don't have to think about it. We don't make a whole calculated measure of how fast. You just know that things are, that stove is hot, I'm not going to touch it. Or that's hot, I'm going to pull my hand away. But these unconscious biases, when they come about people, can also deceive us and prevent us from judging situations and people accurately. Even when we have the time to do those things thoughtfully. In other words, when we don't need to rely on a snap judgment about a person, such as in an interview, you're hiring somebody for a job. You don't have to make a snap judgment about them. I mean, you shouldn't, right? You should take your time. The problem is that the biases that make us cause bad snap judgments are also feeding into even reasoned judgments, but we can't appreciate that that's what's happening. We don't know that that's happening. So let's show you what I mean by this. We're going to paint for ourselves this mental picture on the screen, okay? I'm going to read these words, and then you'll just think about your reactions to these. The words of my doctor from earlier that morning were still ringing in my ears when I found myself slamming the brakes of my car to avoid a nasty collision. An incompetent driver was cutting across 2 lanes toward the freeway exit just in front of me. Still perspiring somewhat, I carried on to drop off my screaming child with the nanny. Okay, that's it. Just that little story. Now, how many people pictured the doctor as a man? Most of you, I would bet, right? I can't see all of you right now in the way we're doing this, but I would imagine most of you, without thinking about it, just envisioned a man as the doctor. And that the nanny that was referred to, you envisioned that nanny as being female. And probably the narrator, who is the principal caregiver for the child, is probably female also in your mind. But there was nothing about what I read that should make you have those instincts. There's nothing about what I read that should tell you that the doctor isn't a woman and the nanny isn't a man. These are the unconscious biases we have, that doctors are men, that principal caregivers for children are women. It's not necessarily a bad or a good judgment. It's just the stuff that we have built into us. And I would suggest to you, whether you're a woman or a man, you all have the same reaction to those words, because the source of our unconscious biases come from our culture. Okay, they come from how we grew up. We all kind of grew up in the same basic culture. And so because these instinctual biases, these unconscious biases were written onto our minds when we were little babies, making our decisions about the way the world works, they're in there for good. They cannot be erased. We can't be cured of the biases we have. Even though some of those biases we can be ashamed of, we shouldn't be ashamed of them because they're just part of us, any more than we're ashamed about the shape of our nose or the color of our hair. But the difference is that these biases can affect our judgments. They can affect our decision making. And if they remain unconscious, that's where the problem is. If we can acknowledge that we have these biases, then all of a sudden, they don't affect our decision making in quite the same way. It's very powerful to uncover these unconscious biases, make them conscious, be aware of them, and then they don't affect our judgments anymore. Again, nobody is calling anybody here a bigot or a sexist or anything. It's just we're all part of it. Women have negative biases about females. Blacks have negative biases about Black people. It's just the way it is because we all grew up in the same culture that basically perpetuated these ideas that are built in instinctually into a very deep part of our brain. It's why, for example, racially motivated police shootings, sometimes the shooter and the victim are both Black. Yes, there's a racial bias going on there, but Black police officers are not necessarily immune. They're not, frankly. Studies have shown that Black police officers have the same instinctual biases about young Black men on the street that white police officers do. That's not making a value judgment, and that's not what this presentation is about. It's just we all grew up in the same culture and we have these unconscious biases. So we have to stop being defensive about them and simply acknowledge it head on. Because once we acknowledge these biases head on, then we can get past them and have our interactions with people be more genuine and more based on merit. So let me give you another example of what we mean by gender bias, okay? And instead of racial bias, we're going to talk about gender bias. There was a big study that took place many years ago, and orchestras, symphony orchestras around the country were having auditions for new positions in the orchestra. And the auditions were exactly what you would imagine. You have a panel of judges who are judging the audition, and then musicians would come in and they would perform in front of the judges, and those judges would make decisions about who was going to be hired for the orchestra based on that audition, exactly as you would imagine. The problem is that only around 11% of the new hires over the course of several years all across the country, only 11% were women. In fact, if you look at an old YouTube video of an orchestra from the 1970s, there were no women in the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. There were no women in the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, which is where I grew up listening to. No women at all. And we all know that that just isn't an accurate representation of some of the best musicians in classical music. A lot of them are women. So what they did was they said, well, we have a problem. We're obviously not hiring women because there's bias in the back of our head that's affecting the way that we are judging the auditions. So instead, they just made themselves blind. They made a violinist or a cellist or an oboist or a flautist perform the audition behind a screen. They couldn't tell who was playing. They couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. They couldn't tell if it was Black or white. They couldn't tell anything. And then all of a sudden, as soon as they started doing that, the hiring of women jumped to 30% overnight. And then now, as you can probably imagine, if you've seen any more recent orchestras, it's about 50-50, as one would imagine. That an orchestra composition looks a lot like the population's composition, 50-50. And it was simply because they removed the ability for the bias to affect their decision-making. So how do we get these biases triggered? How do they get triggered? They get triggered by our senses. We're still, in this way, we consume our world through our five senses. We use visual stimuli, as we talked about, much more often than any other time. We use race and gender or sex age, disability. We make judgments about it when we see it right away. But we also make judgments about sounds. Human beings use vocalizations and the way they talk and the way they pace the way they talk and the way they pitch their voice. And we listen to that, and then we make distinctions among with ourselves based on those things. We modulate our vocal features like accent and tempo and pitch. Sometimes we do it intentionally to appeal more to our audience. For example, I use a lot more Yiddish when I speak to a Jewish audience than I do when I speak to a non-Jewish audience. Because I'm not going to, I want to be able to appeal to them. That's a vocal feature, my choice of words. The way that whether I can change the way that I speak in terms of my accent. I have a thick Baltimore accent if I allow myself, but I don't, because in some settings, it makes people take me less seriously. Okay, so today we're going to examine, this says 2 features. I narrowed this down to one thing because we only have time for one thing today. We're going to examine one feature of pitch in American speech that can lead us to make unfair snap judgments and therefore be implicitly biased about the speakers that use this feature. Okay, now the biggest, before we even talk about the feature, is we listen to speakers talk to us and we make immediate determinations about the way they talk based on youth. So what do we think about youth? Okay, if somebody is speaking to you and they're relatively young, we immediately start thinking inexperience, lack of seriousness. Maybe they're not as smart. They don't lack, they lack life experience. That's a bias. How about sex? So if a woman is talking to you, we have biases built in about weakness and perhaps a lack of intellect. Again, nobody's calling anybody a sexist here. These are just the instinctual biases that we have about female. Lack of intellect or education. Okay, if you perceive that because somebody speaks with a thick Southern accent, for example, or a thick Bronx accent, that people can make unfair snap judgments about them, biased judgments about them, about their lack of education or the lack of intellect. And regional prejudices. Valley girls, you remember those from the 80s, those girls who lived in the Valley and spoke that very peculiar way, or Southerners. Some of the most brilliant people I have known speak with thick accents from Tennessee, and you got to get past it because our brains are telling us this person isn't as educated, this person isn't as sophisticated or serious. These are all biases. Now, this is important when we talk about women because women, as it turns out, linguists, who are the scientists that study language and the use of language, women are innovators when it comes to American English. They're the first ones to adopt certain things the way that we all eventually adopt. They speak in certain ways with their pitch and their vocabulary and their pace and the syntax that they use. All the things that go into oral communication, disproportionately, women are the ones that are inventing these things. Okay? So if they're the ones doing it and we're reacting badly because they're women, then we've got a problem. It means we're being biased about women for no good reason. So if we imagine new speech trends, we'll be talking much more about speech associated with young women than any other group. And so if we react negatively to new speech trends, we're inherently reacting negatively to young women. And that's a problem because study after study after study has shown that women have a particularly big problem. We call it sometimes the Goldilocks effect. Women are either too passive or too pushy, too soft or too loud, too timid or too assertive. They can't win. Goldilocks isn't even a good metaphor here because something was just right for Goldilocks, right? The third chair, the third bed, the third bowl of porridge was just right. I'm not sure. There's some people that think that women literally can't get it just right. There's no way to find the perfect balance because somebody's going to think that they're too passive or too pushy or too timid or too assertive. So we're going to talk about this one feature of speech, and we call it uptalk. Now, some of you may know what I mean by this. I'm going to start using uptalk. And as I talk, we're going to hear what I mean by that. And I hope you stay interested, because as I talk about this, it's really important that you pay attention and listen carefully to how I'm saying it. Do you hear that? Every sentence that I'm saying, it sounds like I'm asking a question at the end. My voice goes up, the pitch of my voice goes up. This is called uptalk. It is very, very common now among younger people, and it is particularly common among young women and particularly common among educated young women. So that the way I was imitating it may have sounded familiar to you in the sense that you've heard some celebrities talk like that, or particularly vapid celebrities like the Kardashians, or people that aren't necessarily the ones that are going to immediately earn our trust and confidence. However, they're not the only ones that talk like this. Here is an example of a woman, and she's seated all the way on the right in the red dress. She is a big deal. She's brilliant. She's an entrepreneur that started one of the biggest internet companies in the country. She is extremely highly regarded, extraordinarily well educated, and she has been asked a question, and listen to how she answers it.
Lead a company. So I'm going to start with you, Michelle, and if you could tell us some successful leadership techniques and how they've worked.
You should just ask my team, not necessarily me. So, I mean, I'm a big believer in there are no silver bullets in anything in life, and so I'll just preface it with that. But I think there's a couple of things that are good guiding principles. I don't think anything I'm going to say is that surprising. But the first is, I think that you have to act consistently as a leader, so your team knows what to expect. It's when you're inconsistent that it's really hard to predict, and I think that makes it really hard.
All right, I'm going to stop it, but I think you can all hear it now. Most of her sentences ended with that uptick in her voice, that uptalk at the end. So let me see, who among you have noticed this before? Can I see your hands? Who's noticed people speaking this way before? Yeah. Now, who's annoyed by it? Do you find it annoying?
Yes.
Yeah, some people do. Most people do. Mrs. Barber doesn't find it annoying. That's good. But a lot of people do. The truth is, I was moved to create this entire bit of research and create this because I was annoyed by it. Just decidedly so. I was really annoyed by it. So let's talk about what's going on here. What is this? And a lot of people have studied this. Some very famous linguists like Thomas Linneman at William and Mary in Virginia has studied this. He was so annoyed by it that he decided to study it, and he's a PhD in linguist and a leader in this field. So what we're talking about with uptalk, particularly with women, is that uptalk can be used to betray at least 3 problems that our biases tell us women have, particularly in competitive environments. Competitive environments like employment or academia or politics. Competitive environment where women need to be taken seriously. So the first is, if women talk with this uptalk, they can be portrayed as having a lack of confidence. The second is, if they talk this way, some people may think that they're compensating or apologizing for their own success or their own correctness. And third is, women may feel like they need to use this as a strategy to be able to hold people's attention, to hold the floor, in order so that they're not interrupted by somebody. So we're going to talk about each one of these 3 things in order. Let's talk about the first, the lack of confidence. Okay, does uptalk make a woman sound like she's unsure of herself? If every sentence it ends like it sounds with a question, some people, not everybody, but some people may feel like, boy, she doesn't seem to be very sure of what she's saying if every single sentence sounds like she's asking a question. That rising intonation at the end can lead somebody to think that. And if she's confident, uptalk can sort of soften that by saying a woman doesn't want to come off too bossy or too authoritative because it's unladylike. And so therefore she'll use this uptalk as a way of softening what she says so that she doesn't feel as though she anybody's going to see that she's too bossy or too assertive. And if she's not confident, this just makes it worse, doesn't it? If she really is speaking about something and she's not sure that she is being persuasive, then this makes it worse, because it makes it just mean even more as though she is lacking confidence, and this time for a good reason. Now, men often do the exact opposite of this. They will say things with much more authoritative tone. They'll say it in a declaratory way with the intonation going down, even and particularly when men don't know what they're talking about. When they do lack confidence, men will try to overcompensate for that by making themselves sound more authoritative. So this is something that women are using, perhaps on purpose and perhaps subconsciously, to be able to deal with the bias that we have about women speakers to begin with. Now let's talk about what happens when women are winning or when they're being persuasive. There is an apology for the success, because successful, winning, authoritative, persuasive women can come off as bossy or unappealing or unladylike in our biased minds. Again, nobody's calling anybody a chauvinist here. This is just the way we all are, at least initially. So a woman giving a correct answer or telling somebody who's a man that works for her as a subordinate, she is going to soften what she says by using uptalk. So it mitigates the force of what she says. She doesn't want to draw negative reactions or negative outcomes from being the boss or from giving a correct answer on a game show. There was a whole study that I don't talk about here on Jeopardy. And women were using uptalk much more often when they gave the answer on Jeopardy, when they were right than when they were wrong. And men, it was just the opposite. Men would give the uptalk only when they were unsure of their answer. When they were definitely sure of their answer, they were very assertive and very declarative about it. So now we talk about holding the floor. Now, we've all seen this with little kids. And most, hopefully all of you have the bracha of having grandchildren. And when they're little, they tell you something that happened at school, or they tell you about something that happened with their friend, and they always have that uptalk at the end. And then I also played with the truck, and then they also did this, and then we had snack time. That little uptalk at the end is the child's way of making sure that you're still paying attention, because children are naturally defensive about the fact that adults may not find what they have to say all that interesting. So they're always trying to make sure you're still listening. I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet. I'm not finished yet. I'm going to keep talking. So women may be employing this as a strategy to continue to hold their speaker's interest, to hold the floor. So they say this is similar to male speakers who do this in different ways. Male speakers who are worried about continuing to hold the attention of their listener will constantly do little check-ins. They'll say, right? Are you with me? They do that. Women don't do that as often. Men do it, but women sometimes use this uptalk as a way of indicating to you, I've got other things coming. Don't turn off. I've got 3 more sentences coming. And even though I haven't asked you a question, it sounds like I do, because I want to hold the floor. I want to hold your interest. This was fascinating. We now have, we have 3 women on the Supreme Court, 3 out of 9. Now, when the study was done, it was mostly 3 other women, because the Justice O'Connor on the Supreme Court is off the court, and Justice Ginsburg, Oliver Shalom, is no longer on the court, obviously, because she died recently. And but it still is amazing that what the Harvard Business Review did was they looked at the transcript of 15 years of Supreme Court arguments, and it turned out that in the last 12 years, when women made up 24% of the judges on the bench, and that was when it was 2 out of 9. Now it's 3 out of 9, so the 33%. A third of the interruptions were of the female justices when they were talking. Either the litigants interrupted them or the other male justices interrupted them. But only 4% were by the female justices. They never interrupted anybody else. They were the ones being interrupted. In 2015, this is amazing. This was only 5 years ago. There were 3 women on the bench on that Supreme Court out of 9, Justice Ginsburg, Oliver Sholem, Justice Sotomayor, and Justice Kagan. Almost 66%, 2/3 of the interruptions were of the 3 female justices on the bench. 2/3. So with more women on the court, it was just getting worse. These are the most important women in United States government, and they're getting interrupted all the time. And now we're wondering why women may be using uptalk to keep people's attention, because men are just too quick and too ready to interrupt women when they need to be saying something important. The problem is that this uptalk is being misinterpreted by our unconscious biases about what it is. Even though there are good reasons for women to be using it, either consciously or unconsciously, we're reacting in a negative, biased way. And that's what we have to get past. So in the UK, for example, in the United Kingdom, they did a study that calculated the responses of 700 male and female bosses. And this was true among men and women who were the bosses. They said 85% of them believe that uptalk indicates a person's insecurity and emotional weakness. 70% said they find it annoying. 57% said that it damages that person's professional credibility. And 44%, almost half, said that they would mark down applicants by about as much as a third. Women that talk this way aren't getting hired. They're losing out on jobs. And for what? Because somebody finds it annoying? Because something that women are doing to defend against our biases are causing our biases to cause us not to hire them. This is the problem. This is why uptalk is a problem. But uptalk isn't the problem, it's us. It's my annoyance that made me create this program. It's Professor Linneman's annoyance that caused him to study this and realize that our annoyance is just our implicit unconscious bias feeding us these lies that say that people that talk this way are weak, they're unsure of themselves, they're not as smart, they're timid. And those are all the things that we unconsciously associate with women. So if it's women doing this, it's reinforcing our biases about women. Well, whose problem is that? Is that women's problem? I don't think so. I think it's our problem. I think it's everyone's problem. But remember what we talk about with unconscious bias. If we make it conscious, if we become aware of it, it doesn't affect us anymore. If we can just say, you know what, uptalk is a thing that's not going away. It's with us to stay. Lots and lots and lots of people talk like this. Instead of being annoyed by it, I'm just going to be aware that a lot of people talk like this. And it doesn't mean anything about who they are as a person. It doesn't mean anything about their intellect. It doesn't mean anything about whether I should be persuaded by what they say or not. As long as we make that conscious decision in our head, we have moved past our unconscious biases. And now we've put the screen in front of us for the orchestra rehearsal, for the orchestra audition. We're not going to be affected by the lies that our biases are telling us. Instead, we're going to talk to women judges and women physicians and women employees and our women bosses and everybody and our political leaders who are women. And we're going to deal with them in a much fairer, much more merit-based way. Our reactions to them are going to be based on the right stuff and not the wrong stuff. It's going to be based on what we think about what they're saying, not how they say it. That's why this all matters. We can't let our annoyance undermine our ability to take seriously what women say, dismissing them as airheads or unsure of themselves, because they're not. If they are, we'll have other cues for that. If a woman is talking to us and everything she says is mishigas, okay, so that's that. But we're basing our judgment on her on the merits, not on the way she says it, what she says. That's fair game, but that's not bias. That's our real judgment coming into play, our real experience coming into play unpolluted and clear from the unconscious biases that we have. So we can, if we do this, we can be sure that when we hear things like uptalk, we can be sure that our interactions with females of all kinds can be based on merit, can be based on real things, objective sources of our judgment. And those interactions can be productive, despite our unconscious biases and despite the fact that you may want to shove your fingers in your ears. And that's where we are. Now, I cut out from this another feature, which maybe one day we'll have time to talk about. It's another thing that women do, and it's called vocal fry. And it's almost the opposite of uptalk. Vocal fry is when your voice gets really low and you croak at the end of your sentences. And it's harder to hear. It's too much time to take for today, but remember, these are things that women do particularly when they talk, and especially educated younger women. We get past these biases, these educated young women are going to assume more and more and more positions of authority because they deserve to. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. First of all, does anyone have any questions before I, don't be shy, you can unmute your mic. One of the things, Jordan, you probably know this because I see that you study implicit bias. The Phoenix Police Department did a training on implicit bias in Phoenix for their department, and it was based on implicit bias based off of race. And of course, explaining that you have implicit biases automatically. And I know that a number of people who were told that they have biases were immediately offended. Like, you know, me? No way. I love every. So that's why I'm fascinated by this. I didn't realize when we talked about the subject, it would be about an implicit bias that we have about it, which is its own unique part of this presentation. It's like if you acknowledge it, you deal with it differently and hopefully in the proper way. So I thought that's pretty fascinating. But people don't like being told.
I think that's absolutely right. Especially police officers don't like to be told that they have implicit biases because they are accused, obviously, all the time. Police officers are accused all the time of acting in a racially biased way. Now, there's a lot of evidence for that happening on occasion, but it's also really important to point out that these implicit biases are not something to be ashamed of because they're such an inherent part of who we are. It's like being, as I said before, it's like being ashamed of the color of your eyes. Something you can do about it. At least with implicit biases, you actually can do something about it. You can acknowledge it so that it doesn't affect your decision making. With police, it's very difficult because with police, they have to react in a split second. But Rabbi Levatov, one of the things that is important to point out is that when you do implicit bias testing, the difference between racially based implicit biases among Black people versus white people is almost identical.
That's actually fascinating. I mean, for us, well, I'm a police chaplain, so I was getting from the inside, but I'm sure, as many of you know, they hired somebody from ASU who was fired because he was plagiarizing. So it became a bigger story that they were doing implicit bias training. So a lot of people know that they took this training. But yeah, it is a fascinating thing to just know that if you know about it, you can already react better.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Stan or Betty, I don't know who has the question.
Yeah, well, you know what I was thinking when Michelle Obama started to speak and give lectures and talks, she was criticized because she didn't do uptalk. She spoke exactly out with no rising inflection at the end. And she was taken to task for that. And they sat down with her and they videoed her speech and used it on a graph to show how she inflects and how she descends. And she changed her speech pattern. Because
I wish she hadn't.
Masculine. She was too masculine.
Yeah, and what you're pointing out is something we talked about a few minutes ago, which is that Goldilocks effect. It's a no-win situation for women. You know, Michelle Obama is exquisitely well-educated. She's a brilliant woman, and when she speaks, we should all be listening very carefully. Even if we disagree with something she may say, we can't, question her intellect or the force of what she's saying. She's a brilliant woman with unbelievable education and incredible experience, and so she shouldn't have to modulate the way she talks because people should be listening to what she says. And so I wish she didn't feel she had to do that, but this is exactly my point. Who's doing this for men? Who is going to men and saying, I don't like the way you pitch your voice? That's never happened ever. It's like a joke.
And the other thing is, I watch a lot of opera, and you have a lot of trouser roles where women play male roles. And there was this one woman who does a lot of trouser roles. And she said the difference is when you are dressed as a man, it's down to the ground. And when you are dressed as a woman, it's up.
Mm-hmm.
I relate that to you.
That's interesting. I like that. I hadn't thought of that before. That's real. That's really interesting.
Myra wrote a question in the chat. I'm not sure. How do we speak with authority? Myra, do you want to explain or elaborate on that? Do you want to learn the correct octave to speak? Is that you're asking?
Yeah, I don't want to speak in uptick. I don't know if I do speak in uptick. I don't know how I speak, but how can I, as a woman, speak with authority?
I suggest, and this is an imperfect answer because we live in an imperfect world. I don't think you should change the way you speak at all. I think that we all learn to speak with authority based on what we say. If we are speaking about something that we know about and we're doing so passionately and articulately, that is how to speak persuasively. That is how to speak with authority. And the tone of our voice or the accent that we use when we speak English or the facial expressions we make or any of the number of things or the fact that our voice is a female voice or a male voice should not matter. And that's why it's an imperfect answer, because it does still matter. But enough people giving enough of these kinds of talks to enough other people, hopefully people will begin to change the way that they consume other people's oral communication. And you shouldn't change at all the way you speak, because if you speak with authority, you speak with authority. And people are going to get past the fact that you're a woman or get past the fact that maybe they can hear your relative age in your voice, which frankly I can't, but some people can. You know, you can hear when somebody is not 25 years old anymore. And there are biases about age as well. Oh, this person's older. I don't need to take them as seriously. Again, these biased things. If we get past these things in our lives, then you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about changing anything. You just have to worry about what you say, which has always been true.
I had a
Sure, go for it, Sam.
I have a question. It's a situation I had when I was a kid. I came back from a date about 1 o'clock in the morning. I lived in a small apartment house that was all white. I went to get on the elevator and a black man got on the elevator with me. And I was a little hesitant because I knew we didn't have any black tenants in the building. And then the elevator proceeded to go down to the basement where he got off. And when he went down to the basement, I got more anxious. On the other hand, I didn't want to offend him. I didn't want him to think I was prejudiced. In hindsight, I probably should have, if I was looking for a safety point of view, I would have gotten off the elevator because there was nobody in the building that looked like this guy. I found out from the superintendent he had hired this guy to do some work around the building late at night when most people were away. So right. In my mind, there was a prejudice, which I didn't act on. I acted on it up here, but I didn't act on it physically.
Yeah, in that moment, because you were trying to be more thoughtful, you were aware in that moment that your initial snap judgment was biased and wasn't really based on anything other than a generalization that your brain was making about black men. Well, and some other circumstantial cues about the fact that the building was, back then when you were a young man, buildings were segregated, black men didn't live there, and I get it. And in that moment, you did what we've been talking about in that moment. Unfortunately, that's the exception and not the rule. In that same scenario, imagine a woman who's got a purse. 10 women out of 10 are going to clutch their purse tighter against their body when they see a black man get on the elevator. That's a snap judgment that they may not even do consciously. Yeah. And they're not even going to think about why they did that. And these are the kinds of snap judgments that we love to be able to get away from, because you're right. For all you know, that cost you an opportunity to make a friend that day. I don't know. I mean, I don't mean to be silly and naive about that, but my point is that you get to a point where these snap judgments and these biases cost us important things that could happen in our lives that would be really positive. They cost us the ability to hire the perfect employee because we had something biased that says, oh, I don't know about that person. Or, you know, he speaks like he's from a Black neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I don't know that my customers are going to like that, even though he's very qualified. And then that costs you a great employee. These are the kinds of things we get away from. And in that moment, you've thought past your bias. And if we do more and more and more of that, we do better. We do better with our personal interactions. We just do.
So
what if I had been wrong?
Yeah, but you know what? You could be wrong. And if you had had no reaction and the guy on the elevator was a burglar and he was white,
yeah,
well, you know, you could have been a victim of a crime that day, chas v'shalom, but yeah. Okay. then your biases not only lied to you about the Black man, lied to you about the white guy. See that these biases are not helpful to us. They lie to us.
Thank you. So you're telling me that Fox's The Masked Singer is all about the blind audition?
Well, it is interesting. I mean, we've seen it in popular culture a lot. There was that really famous thing where it was on one of those different shows, The Voice, I think may have been on, or American Idol, or one of these shows. I don't watch them. But there was a very homely, Niskite English woman who came on. It was super famous. This happened, and everybody immediately assumed that this was going to be terrible. And then she opened her mouth, and it was the most glorious thing anybody had ever heard. And the reason it was such a big deal is because everybody had judged her based solely on the fact that she was a homely woman. If she'd been beautiful, nobody would have been shocked at how magnificently she sung. This is exactly the same thing. We make judgments about what we see, and somebody's attractiveness is just the same as a bias as it is about the color of someone's skin, or the fact that they're overweight. You know, we have this terrible bias in our culture that overweight people are not smart, or they're weak, or they lack self-discipline. Crazy.
I have to tell you a little coda to the thing about the blind auditions. There's now a movement to get rid of the blind auditions because they're not hiring enough Black players. So it's kind of funny.
Is that affirmative action? Like I'm lost on
yes. That. Yeah, the idea is that we want to be able to put a thumb on the scale in favor of a Black musician for our orchestra because they're so underrepresented in our orchestra that we don't think that we can be as good an organization without diversity, and therefore we want to be able to see that the person's Black so that we can give them a little bit extra credit and say, well, maybe you didn't play quite as well as this person, but you played well enough, and we're going to hire the Black applicant so that our orchestra can reflect what our audience looks like, which is, you know, this is what universities are doing constantly. They're saying, you know, everybody's saying, well, you should be completely racially blind to the applicants to your university. And the universities are saying, if we do that, we're just simply going to wind up with 85% Asian boys. You know, we won't have anywhere near the kind of diversity that we need to have as an organization or as a student body, because, and our educational community will not be as good as it could be if it were truly as diverse as we'd like it to be. You can argue about whether that's the right goal, but orchestras that want to hire Black musicians, they say we're never going to be able to get enough if we aren't aware that they're Black when they audition for us.
Yeah.
So you being a jazz musician, do you see that?
Well, it's been a lot of years since I've auditioned for anything. What I can tell you is that I've never gone through a blind audition for anything. You know, jazz is the kind of thing where we saw racial bias take place in exactly the opposite way. When jazz became, you know, the enormous force of American culture that it did in the late 30s into the 40s and then in the 50s before it gave way to rock and roll, the jazz world and the biggest stars in jazz world, with a few notable exceptions, but they were disproportionately Black. And it became a thing that the black musicians really didn't think that white musicians were good enough to play with them. Miles Davis, who most of you know is one of the great jazz trumpet players of all time, never worked with white musicians until a piano player named Bill Evans, whom he fell absolutely in love with, and hired Bill Evans to be his pianist. And all of these other black musicians said, something's wrong with Miles. I don't understand why he would hire a white guy to play piano for him. This is crazy. You know, aren't there, you know, how do you hire some white dude who's not going to be any good? It was same bias. Now, Bill Evans is legendary in the jazz world, and the rest is history. But yeah, these are the kinds of things. There are racial things, there are gender-based things, there are age-related things. You know, age is a thing. I can assure you that when there are applications to be a judge, there are certainly, in the bankruptcy world, bankruptcy judges are not, they're the only federal judges that are not nominated by the president and appointed by, and confirmed by the Senate. They're actually hired after an application process. And for many years, they weren't hiring anybody except for people that were in their 60s. And it was always because, how can you be a good judge unless you're very experienced and you've been practicing law for decades? Well, they were getting a lot of people that were at the end of their careers. They weren't as motivated. They wanted to slow down. And so the bankruptcy bench was not as strong as it could be because there was a bias against younger applicants. And they've changed that when they realized that there was this bias, and they got rid of it. But, you know, we see bias working in both ways. Sometimes disadvantaged groups in one setting are highly advantaged groups in another setting.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. Any last questions? I
just wanted to mention one thing. I went to Bronx Science in the 50s. I graduated in 50. And it was 90% Jewish, 85, 90% Jewish. Now it is predominantly Asian. Mm-hmm. And they're talking about, you know, that they don't have enough blacks and Latinos in the mm-hmm. schools. I have a close friend of mine who's black who went with me to Bronx Science. And he still feels that the exams are valid. His attitude and mine as well is, the problem is that the kids are not getting as good an education in the lower grades to prepare them, because in most of the segregated areas, the teachers there are newer teachers who aren't as experienced, and it perpetuates a situation. Right. And they're blaming it on, do you get rid of the exam because you want to have a more integrated group, or do you bring these kids up from the lower grades where they get a better education so they're capable of getting in? And that's,
and it's a chicken and egg. It's a chicken and egg problem. This is a fascinating issue. And if you haven't, for the rest of you, if you haven't been reading about this discussion about the entrance exams to get into the magnet schools in New York City, Bronx Science and Stuyvesant, and, you know, this is a fascinating issue, and it's so much more complicated than just affirmative action. Yeah. It's so much more complicated and nuanced. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. It's like raise the bridge or lower the water.
Yeah.
Right. So let me ask you a question, because this is sort of on Wednesday, we're having an FBI agent come on who's Jewish. How common is it to see Jewish law enforcement? And is there a bias in the families that, you know, what's a good Jewish kid being a cop type of a thing, or is it just they're in other academia or whatever? But, you know, that's just to plug Wednesday's program. That's a special agent, legal attaché, who's going to talk about, in general, the legal attaché department of international investigations within the FBI. But he's definitely an anomaly. There are very few Jewish, I'm going to say for sure, in the federal law enforcement agencies. We have a good friend here locally who's DEA. I think he doesn't know another Jewish DEA agent. And he's been stationed in already 3 different states. So
yes,
just interesting. But that could be something totally different. But this is, the implicit bias is definitely a fascinating conversation that's not over. I mean, because it comes up in so, like you say, you're just talking about voice, race, as you mentioned with the elevator, it's just everywhere.
Indeed.
But I like how you mentioned that it's also necessary for the situations that warrant fear, or like you say, the skin on your back or the hair on your back that's part of your bias, but it's also your your defense mechanism to judging in a good way, where it helps.
That's right.
So that's a part I never really connected to. That's fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm gonna, Lori, did you have a question? Were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I would say it never entered my mind that something as subtle as voice would, you know, set off a bias. I don't know why, but, you know, that type of talking. So that was very fascinating. You know, I see color, you know, and that I've heard of, but I'd never heard of anything like voice. Are there other intonations and stuff as well on voice that set things off?
Yeah, as I mentioned at the end, there is another feature that is called vocal fry, F-R-Y. And if you could look it up, or if you're really, really interested in it, I could come back and talk about it another time. But suffice it to say, that's another strategy that disproportionately women are using to add gravitas or importance to the tone of their voice. Some people say it's women trying to sound more like men. I think that's an oversimplification, but yes, there are things that people do. There are also things that people do to remove regional accents on purpose so that they can be taken more seriously, or they adopt an accent as an affectation to sound more serious. If anybody is a fan of Madonna, who is from, you know, I think she's from Philadelphia, okay? She moved to England a lot of years ago, and within 10 seconds, she was speaking with this ridiculous English accent, probably because she wanted people to take her more seriously or something. We all do these kinds of things because we are at least subconsciously aware that people may be making unfair judgments about us in the way we speak.
Do glasses make you more intellectual? Because I always thought it was an English accent and glasses.
I actually had that experience not long ago. There was somebody that I was speaking with. He was a guy that was hired by a client of mine, and he wore glasses, and he was from England, and he spoke with a very posh English accent, really from like the north of the center of London. So it was a very, very well-regarded accent. And after I got past my initial reaction thinking, wow, this guy's such a big deal, I realized he's an idiot. Everything he was saying was so silly. And I just realized he sounds great until you listen to what he's saying. And this is, again, get past the initial reaction and listen to what they're really saying. You can make a much more accurate judgment.
Lou, you get final comments here.
I think he just said somewhat the same. If you're aware of bias, yours, theirs, there's nothing wrong with it. This first impression, you know, the reason black people are picked up more in crime areas is because that's where the crime is, you know. Mm-hmm. But if you're aware of that and you get past the first sentence or the second, and you listen, I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
Exactly.
By the way, isn't Harvard just, I think, lost? No, Harvard won the case that they don't have to go just on grades. You don't have, you can select other things to form your student body the way you want. And the Asian students were saying that they have higher grades and they're not being always let in. And Harvard said, that's the way it is. And that was okay.
Yeah, the case was really interesting because much of the argument in front of the court that had to do with this case really had to do with the historical path of Jews in higher education. So back in the 20s and 30s, an institution like Harvard would not admit Jews at all, period. They just simply wouldn't admit them, and that was the end of it. And we all know why. And then really in the 40s and 50s, Harvard and a lot of the other Ivy League schools, like the one I went to Brown, began to admit limited numbers of Jews, saying, well, we've got to admit some of these so nobody can accuse us of being anti-Semites. So we'll have a little bit of a quota and we'll admit a handful of Jews each year. And that's the way it was. It really persisted into the 60s. And then they started saying, well, now in the 60s with the civil rights movement, we're going to completely open up our admissions, and it's going to be completely blind as to who the applicant is. And all of a sudden, half of the Ivy League student body was Jewish. Now they had so many Jews, they didn't know what to do with it. And it was like it's going to turn into, the Hillel had more people in it than, anything. And so it became a big problem, not because the schools were hostile to Jews, but just because they say we're losing the diversity that we want to accomplish. Because if we go strictly on merit, all the smartest kids coming out of high school are all these Jewish guys. Well, it's the same thing that's happening with Asians now. Culturally, for whatever reason, Asians are grossly overrepresented in high achieving kids in high school. It's just the way it was with Jews a couple generations ago. Now it's the Asians. And what Harvard is basically saying is we have to not admit everybody based purely on merit, because if we did, our student body is going to be disproportionately Asian, and we don't want it to look like that. It's not good for anybody. It's interesting.
Yeah. And I am very curious on the statistic about the interruptions with the Supreme Court. Do we have a record of which justices interrupted more?
Yeah, we do. We know that the men interrupted the women much more as a group. We also know that Justice Thomas, who is still on the court, doesn't speak ever. So he wasn't the one interrupting anybody, because as far as anybody could tell, he doesn't have a vocal box.
Right.
But suffice it to say that Justice Scalia, who is now gone, obviously he interrupted often. Justice Rehnquist, he's also gone, interrupted very often. But it was a problem. Justice Breyer, who is still on the court, interrupted occasionally, not often. He's a much more gentle guy, Jewish guy. But suffice it to say that the one justice who has been interrupted more than any other justice, male or female, is Justice Sotomayor. And she happens to be not only a woman, but the only woman of color on the court. So you can draw your own conclusions about that.
Wow. Well, thank you again for today. This was fascinating, informative, and we might get you back for the vocal fry. I don't know.
All right. Well, this was thrilling to me to spend time with all of you. You all look great on your Zoom windows, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job.